Yes, I can hear
Okay,
you.
okay. I'm checking just because I think I might be having slow internet. But anyways, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zubatsanda Kumete. I've actually become a member of YIPA, but as I've been introduced, I'm a town and regional planner by training, and I work in NASHO in charge of the municipal social housing program. So we've prepared one presentation, which is divided into two sections. And the first part, I'll be presenting it. And then when I get to the right section, then Malcolm, my GM, will take over. And then at the end, we'll be able to take questions. Um, yeah, Malcolm, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself at the moment, or are we getting straight into the presentation?
Well, very quickly, I'm Malcolm McCarthy, and I'm the general manager at NASHO, National Association of Social Housing Organizations. So I will be rattling your ears in the second part of the presentation. So it's over to Batandwa.
Thanks, Malcolm. So firstly, who is NASHO? NASHO is a federation of independent social housing institutions, and I'll explain in a short while exactly what social housing institutions are. But so we're a federation of non-profit SHIs, which actually develop, manage, and operate social housing throughout South Africa, and mostly focused in the urban environments of the country. So that would be the big cities in the country, as well as some of the more affluent suburban nodes or the secondary nodes in the country. So NASHO as an organization, we are a non-profit organization which has a strong commitment to building a strong and sustainable social housing sector in the country. Yeah, and that's mostly who we are. The reason we have this strong commitment in social housing is because we believe that if we have a strong social housing sector, number one, we'll be able to build housing units, rental housing units, which can house a lot of people who actually need decent housing in the better located parts of our cities. And then number two, if we are facilitating in this space, it actually helps municipalities to be able to build rental housing, which then becomes an asset to the municipality that they can use to take forward or to encourage spatial transformation, which is something that we are really wanting to achieve. And in the work that we do, we focus on developing the capacity or supporting the capacity of the key stakeholders in the sector. And these stakeholders, there's a range of them. There's municipalities, which are local governments, there's provincial governments. Sometimes we're working with financiers as well as the regulatory authority. So in the work that we do in building capacity, we do engage with all of these different stakeholders. And how do we do this? We do this through a range of programs that we run. We do some sector research, just research in the sector to be able to get real data that can be used to push forward or to progress the social housing space. We do assist with putting together tools and instruments to be able to do some proper monitoring and evaluation of the happenings in the sector. We do get involved in putting together innovative projects or pilot projects, and one of them I think I'll mention as the presentation progresses. And then above that, we actually assist in information sharing in the sector, as well as just being there to provide the technical advice and support to all stakeholders that I've mentioned. And at the moment, whilst I'm on there, we are currently running an incubation program, which is targeting SHIs. Again, I'll explain who SHIs are. And then the other part is targeting municipalities. So in a nutshell, that's who we are. So a lot of you are probably asking, so what is the social housing thing? What is social housing? This guy has spoken a lot, but he hasn't actually told us what social housing is. Social housing social housing is not what you see on the screen at the moment. So if you look at that, it's probably familiar. Well, it's very familiar to me, and it might be familiar to most of you, because we obviously live in South Africa. This is BNG housing. This is RTP housing, low-cost housing. And we all know what the characteristics of such housing are. Usually this type of housing is located on the urban fringes, on marginal areas where there's sometimes the roads are not tarred, or just there's a depletion, or there's very limited access to socio-economic opportunities or facilities within those spaces. So social housing is not this. And the reason we are sharing these pictures and I'm telling you what social housing is not is because there's a misconception that all government housing programs look like RDP or are RDP. Social housing is not RDP. And what you see on your screen right now, this is a little different. It's much better than the RDP housing, but it's not RDP housing. This is single stand type of housing, which is financed, which is linked to another government program, which is known as FLISP, the Finance Linked Individual Subsidy Program. I'm sure most of you have heard about FLISP lately, because it's suddenly become easier for people with low incomes to be able to purchase property for the first time. And a lot of the narrative in the space is a lot of people are not actually taking advantage of government subsidies, which can help them to own property, such as FLISP. So these are examples of what FLISP is. Again, this is not social housing. Again, this is not social housing. If you look at this on the top left, those tin-like structures, non-permanent structures, those sometimes are referred to as transitional housing. Sometimes in municipalities, they develop stuff like that to house people temporarily. Again, that's not social housing. And if you look on the top right, that picture there of that house with the green roof, that facility with the bluish roof, that's one of the innovative projects that I mentioned at the beginning that we've been a part of. That's a transitional housing facility, which is located in Cape Town, which Malcolm and others were quite instrumental in putting together. And the whole purpose of the transitional housing facility is to provide decent housing for people who are actually below the low income earning category. So it's people who don't have a consistent income. So people who get income on a daily basis and they need just a place to be able to rest for the nights and things like that. So that's a transitional housing facility. The typology, as you can see, mostly it's 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms. If you look at the sizes, it's 10 square meters to maybe 15 square meters for new buildings. And then for refurbishments, it's just a little more than that. Another characteristic of this is the shared facilities. So the kitchen would be shared, the living areas would be shared, but we quite worked hard to make sure that at least the bathrooms are separated. So once everything else is shared, but the bathrooms are separated. So there's female bathrooms and then there's male bathrooms. And then there's obviously on-site management to manage the property. So in some municipalities, this is going up. And that's an example that's in the city of Cape Town. So all of that are examples of what social housing is not. And then this is the grand reveal of what social housing is after all that suspense. This is social housing. This is a project which was developed by a social housing institution in Pretoria called YIST Social Housing Corporation, if I'm not mistaken. It's well located. It's stuck in the right place. It's in the center of Tshwane, city of Tshwane. As you can see, the density of it is a bit higher, or it's a bit more than what you had seen in the previous picture, where it was single stand dwelling units. These are 4-story walk-ups. And then if you see in the periphery of the 4-story walk-ups, you see that there's higher densities going on there. If you look at that, I think that's a 12-story high building, which speaks to exactly what the social housing program tries to achieve. So it's about building the right type of housing, which is decent and affordable in the right places to be able to meet the spatial restructuring objectives, which I'll speak about in a short while. And this is another social housing project, which is a good example of what social housing is and what it can achieve. This is the one on the left It's a project that was developed by an SHI called Own Haven, which is based in East London. As you can see, it's a high density type of residential building block instead of on what social housing is not. That's in Gqeberha. Here's another example, a 4-story example of what social housing can be. This is a project in Cape Town. I think it was developed by, it's either Madula Moho or Soko. And the characteristics of it, the reason this picture is here is because we wanted to show you that it's not just about building boxes where you put people in and then you say we've provided decent housing. It's actually about how do we ensure that the technical skills that are in the municipality, from town planners, architects, and so on, are actually used to be able to create decent environments where people can live and thrive. If you look at it, it embodies good urban design principles, it has strong access to affordable public transport, and it tries by all means to create decent public spaces that the residents of such units can actually enjoy, to have a comfortable environment. And if you look at it and you compare it to what we term or what we know government housing programs to be, it's very different to that. It's very different to that. It sort of inspires hope, and which is what social housing is about. And then this one is in the middle of Hillbrow in Johannesburg. It's actually a refurbishment or a conversion of an old building into social housing. And what's special about this specific project is that I think it officially came online in 2010, and it was one of the legacy projects which the national team of the Netherlands national team was able to contribute to developing and leaving such a legacy for South Africa and for people in Hillbrow. And as you can see, there's a soccer pitch, and there are other facilities within the space which the team was able to put together for the residents. So social housing is not RDP. Social housing tries to do much more than that, and it actually even tries to encourage the densification of spaces and creating sustainable neighborhoods. That's what social housing is in pictures, but I'll explain it a bit more in the next slides in terms of exactly what are the objectives of the program and what is the intent of the program. So just briefly, in the country at the moment, we're sitting on about 40,000 social housing units, which have been built and are under management. And if you look at that number vis-a-vis the size of the population in the country and people who actually need decent housing, I think it's clear for everyone and anyone to see that there's still a huge shortfall. These 40,000 units are currently being managed by only 26 delivery agents in the country. So we do need to bring these numbers up. These numbers fall far short from what government's targets is. And to be able to bring these numbers up, we do have to bring in new, young, vibrant SHIs into the sector, delivery agents into the sector. And then hopefully some of you might be inspired to actually set up such organizations or institutions to be able to contribute to the realization of more units, because we need these units. So what is the social housing? What is this program in terms of the act, and what is the intention? What does it try to achieve? The social housing program is one of government's human settlements programs. So it's one of government's national housing programs, just like ORDP and the other types of housing. But so what makes this program specifically different is that there's a strong socio-economic context which underlies it. That underlying socio-economic context really has a mandate of transforming South Africa and of transforming the urban environments of the country. The program has its own legislation. The reason I bring up that it has its own legislation is because not all human settlement programs or not all housing programs in the country have a legislation or have a legislative context which is as well built as the social housing one. So there is a Social Housing Act of 2008, which has strong regulations, which has strong controls. I mean, it regulates and it has rules on how developments are actually funded, and it has strong controls on how the assets that have been developed through the subsidy actually get used. So those instruments are built into the program, which is something that is actually very, very, very positive given the context that we live in. So these rules and controls are actually implemented and overseen by the regulatory authority, which is the SHRA. The SHRA is not a government department it's not a government department. The SHRA is a government entity which sits outside of government departments, and its sole mandate is to make sure that the capital subsidy that the government provides is actually used in the right way for the right purposes. Next, Malcolm.
Hi. Sorry, Malcolm is going to be our next speaker.
No, but
you know, but I know you've actually spiked up so many questions amongst our listeners. I'd like you to actually just perhaps just address a few of these questions, and then after that, I will introduce Malcolm, and he can continue with the presentation. Okay. So one of the
can I just, I'm happy that we can have some questions. That's really what we want, a much more interactive session. But Tandwe will go on with his presentation a little bit longer before I do the bit on financing.
Oh, okay. So, but Tandwe, you're not done yet.
No,
I'm not done yet.
Okay.
He was just chasing me along to move the slides. That's fine.
Okay, time to continue.
Okay, but I'm glad to see that there's already questions loaded up for us, which means people are
I'm also excited.
Somewhat interested. So what's the intention of the social housing program? The social housing program answers a very critical question in our country, and this question is: how does government break away from the apartheid legacy of spatial planning? How do we reverse that? Because if you look at our environments and the way people live, that legacy question is, how do we reverse this? And social housing is one of those programs which is going to assist governments to be able to reverse such. So the social housing program, its clear intent is answering the question of how do we get residential integration in the urban environments of our cities, and through that, how do we ensure that this residential integration actually provides housing opportunities for people who are on low and moderate incomes? I will explain what it's really about: redressing the spatial segregation of the apartheid through providing better quality urban environments through the provision of decent, well-located and well-managed housing. That's the first one. So it's a spatial objective to redress that. And then the second objective is because people have been pushed away, and now we're saying we want to build social housing in good environments. So the question is, how do we make sure that people with low and moderate incomes are able to take charge of the development of their own households? So it's about bringing people into the city so that they have good access to AMA facilities that are located within the city, whether it's home affairs, whether it's to libraries, whether it's to clinics, whether it's to job opportunities. So through the social housing, through achieving the social housing, we should be able to create the environments for people to be able to take charge of their own developments by having access to such opportunities. And then lastly, which is important, especially now in most of our cities, considering that I know in eThekwini, for example, where I'm from, they're currently putting together the integrated public transport system, where they have identified specific corridors that present the most opportunity, and within those corridors, they've invested heavily on public transport. So now the question is, how do we make sure that people actually live as close as possible to such corridors? So social housing can contribute to the densification of the city. And by contributing to the densification of the city, we make sure that government subsidy or government resources are actually used more efficiently. So how do we achieve all of this that I've mentioned? It's through the provision of good quality, well-located housing, which is well managed. And this is rental housing. Remember, it's not ownership housing, it's rental housing. And the reason it's rental housing is because we want to secure these opportunities, not just for one family, because if it was for ownership, it would be one family who gets access to this property and their owners. But we want to be able to secure such opportunities for 3 or 4 or 5 different families over a period of time. That's why this is a rental housing program. Government provides a capital subsidy. So government provides a subsidy to be able to achieve or to realize the development of the social housing. So the question of what is low and moderate income in terms of government, so in terms of the Social Housing Act, low to moderate income are people who are classified as people who earn between 1,500 Rand a month up to 15,000 Rand. So that 1,500 Rand, if you compare it to the 3,500 Rand, which is the minimum, which is the minimum wage in the country, or the threshold for qualifying for RDP, you quite see clearly that there is an overlap there. But that's because we want to be able to create opportunities for the poorest of the poor to be able to access housing. So next, Malcolm. So I've said a lot about where this housing must be located. Maybe the question that's lingering in your minds is, what instruments has government put together to be able to target this housing product? There is something that's known as the restructuring zones. So social housing can only be developed in restructuring zones. What are restructuring zones? Restructuring zones are designated areas within the urban environments or within cities or suburban nodes, which municipalities identify by themselves and make sure that identification of such areas is actually aligned with their IDP or their SDFs or their plans for restructuring the urban environment. These are areas which mostly have the most opportunities for employment, which have the most opportunity for investments, so on and so on. So these areas are identified by municipalities in conjunction with province. And then finally, it's national governments who gazette these areas as restructuring zones. And social housing can only be developed in such areas. So can anyone build a social housing? Can anyone who just thinks this is a great idea and they've heard that there's a subsidy involved, which is free money, can anyone build it? The answer is no. Social housing cannot be built by anyone. To build social housing, you are either an ODA, which is which is known as an other development agency. These are usually for-profit companies, which don't necessarily get monitored which don't necessarily get monitored or performance checked by the SHA as a company. Just the projects gets performance monitored. And then the main delivery agents in the space is what's called as a social housing institution, SHIs. These are non-profit companies, registered as Section 21 companies, and they have to be accredited by the SHA. So it's only accredited social housing institutions which can build a social housing or ODAs. And if you do that, you then get access to the government grants or the capital subsidy, which is the main attraction to the social housing space for companies. And Malcolm, I think he will elaborate on that further in a short while. So this is going to be the last slide I'll speak about. So here, I think I'm just going to elaborate on who this government entity that I mentioned is. It's the who regulates the sector. This government entity is known as the SHA. It's the Social Housing Regulatory Authority. They're based in Johannesburg, but they obviously have a national footprint because social housing can be built anywhere in the country. They're established in terms of the Public Finance Management Act, and their primary function is to ensure that they invest in the sector and they enable the sector, as well as regulate the sector, and to make sure that affordable rental housing actually happens in the South African space. So what is it that they do? They actually oversee the allocation of these capital grants. So an SHI would have to package a project and make an application to the SHA to be able to access such grants. So they function in that is to be able to receive applications and do the allocation of grants and approve, do the allocation of grants for projects that have been approved. But even more so, what they do, which is a strong plus or a strong motivator in the sectors, that they actually ensure that the subsidy that they've invested is used over the long term for exactly what it's been allocated for development of social housing. So social housing institutions cannot apply to the SHA and then use that money for something else. They have to use it for social housing. And then through the monitoring, there are various KPIs that SHIs must meet, and they report to the SHA on a quarterly basis. I would like to stop there, and then Malcolm, you can carry on, please, and then we shall take questions.
Sorry, gentlemen, would you like to take questions now? Are you happy with
Okay. No, I'd much rather Malcolm presents as well, so that the full picture is created before we take questions. For some of the questions that might come up, Malcolm would have answered.
All right. Okay. So, Malcolm, can I quickly just make a brief introduction of yourself? Malcolm is the general manager at NASHO. He's got about 40 years of vast experience in social housing as well as municipal housing. So please, ladies and gentlemen, please pay attention and grasp as much as you can. Thank you, Malcolm. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Batandwa, for sketching very clearly the background to the program itself. So I'm going to talk money, really, because like anything in life, it doesn't happen very easily without investment. And because it's government investment we're using, we have to be additionally careful that we make sure that it does the job that it's supposed to do. And Batandwa has very clearly said the job that it's supposed to do is that it needs to be an investment that changes the nature of our cities. So it integrates, it gives people on low and moderate incomes who previously were excluded from certain urban spaces, the opportunity to live in those spaces and to actually benefit really from a lot of the socioeconomic resources that are there. So how does this financing actually work? It was mentioned earlier that the primary government financing that goes into social housing projects is a capital grant. And this capital grant accounts for between 60 and 70% of the capital costs. Now, I'm sure sitting in this session today, we've got a number of financial experts, accountants, and other people who will see that if you're getting this as actual capital investment in the project, it means you don't have to realize a return on it, which means you don't have to pay the government back on a regular basis for that money. So it becomes the subsidy. And you've got to be able to turn that subsidy into a subsidy for the people who are actually living in the units. And that's the big challenge. So it's a subsidy that covers about 70% of the cost. I'm not going to bore you too much. There are two parts to the subsidy, one which is coming from national government and the other which is coming from the provincial government. But both of them are administered by the SHRA, and they can only be allocated if your project meets all the requirements that the SHRA has. So it has to be within a restructuring zone, it has to be a particular quality of unit, it has to be particular sizes of units, it has to show that in the long run, you're going to be able to make the project work, not just delivering the capital product in the ground, but that it's going to work over the 25-year life of the property in terms of the management of the property, and also the making sure you protect the assets. The second part of the financing is what is called loan or equity financing. That means that 30%, and I'm going to show you in real cost numbers in a short while, that 30% extra that you have to do has to either be equity, that's extra money that you happen to have that you can invest, or you've got an equity partner who comes in and invests it, or it has to be loan finance, or a combination of both. That's also possible. What's happening at the moment in the sector is it's mainly loan finance, and it's coming mainly from the National Housing Finance Corporation, which is a government housing bank. But there are some of the other banks and some of the other financial institutions who are becoming more interested in loaning into the sector. And usually the loan finance is coming in at prime, between prime and prime plus 3%, depending upon how the lender assesses the risk of a particular project. Now, clearly the thing about this is that if you're going to have to repay the equity, or particularly repay a loan financing, you've got to have money with which to do it. So that part is then collected from the tenants, and that then becomes part of the overall rental. But because you've had the grant money, there's still subsidy that sits within that particular unit. Okay, and then of course the other place that money comes from is the rental itself. So in social housing, you're not like you're a private landlord wanting to get the very most you can for the renting out of that property. You have to set what are called economic cost recovery rentals. So you've got to set rentals that are going to cover your costs of management and also of repayment of the loan, but at the same time in a way that makes it affordable to the people in that income range between 1,500 and 15,000. And I'll explain the sort of spread of those incomes in a moment. And so the capital repayment is part of it. The management costs, if you have to, any of you have been involved in managing properties before, or even have your own place that you're renting out, you'll know that there are all sorts of extra costs. There are municipal rates, their electricity, their water costs. If it's compulsory to have these sorts of buildings properly insured in case something happens to them. You've got the cost of maintenance. You've got the cost of actually collecting rentals, because if you're collecting rentals, you've got to have staff who have to do that, who have to keep the books, etc., etc. So those are all costs. But also what you've got to do is make sure you put aside a certain amount every month in a reserve, because you're going to have the long-term maintenance costs as well. At a certain stage, the roof is going to wear out, or the guttering is going to wear out, or you're going to have to repaint the outside. So you've got to have ways of covering those costs. But you've got to set up those costs, that income that's going to come in a way that it makes for different levels of rentals which are affordable to the different income brackets that you actually see. So let me give you an example of this. Okay, so we reckon at the moment the average cost of a unit in social housing is around about 430,000, 440,000. That's a 40 square meter unit, which is the average size. So you take your 154, which is your national government subsidy. You take your 120, which is your institutional subsidy. And then you take your loan finance and or equity, and it's about 156,000 in that equation. So then you want to now have to repay the loan, that amount of 156 per unit, and that would be in the region of about 1,300 or 1,400 on average per unit. So that must become, if you sit in the average rentals, that's an amount that you have to actually look at. When I put this figure 1560, that was when the rental rate was, when the lending rate was higher, because don't forget, just over the COVID period, the lending rate has come down quite significant. Well, reasonably, to a reasonably lower level. This quickly just shows it. So on the one hand, you've got what I call your input costs, which is your capital loan repayment, your admin and support services, and your direct management costs. On the other side, you've got your income. And the only places you can get income from are tenant rentals. In certain instances, you might have a small commercial part to the actual development, so the commercial rentals. And then if you get any additional subsidy, which you might do from some municipalities, like some of them will reduce the rates that you have to pay, or they might give you other concessions. And those are the things that have to make this particular financial equation work. Okay, I'm not going to go into that. So let's just look at, when we say you've got to deal with your administrative costs, these are some of the things. You'll have an office, and you'll have rentals, and you'll have the utilities in the office. You'll have your communication costs, because your staff will have to have phones, etc., to be able to talk to people. You'll have transport costs at certain times, your back office support services. You've got to have a team that deals with the financials, the human relations, the IT. You have to pay for rent collection. You have to at times have legal action. For instance, if a tenant is able to pay and is not paying, you need to take legal action against them. And you also have a bad debt. You are going to have a number of tenants who end up not paying, and you're going to have to write off some of that. Although with the best social housing institutions, they're maintaining levels of, this was before COVID, 95 to 97% payment levels, which is quite amazing given the income range that they're dealing with. So we estimate, when you're looking at the rental amount, that the cost, these administrative costs on average sit between 500 and 700 Rand a month. Okay. Then you have your management costs, and those are your rates, your municipal services, your communal utilities, insurance, maintenance, both reactive and planned, security, cleaning, gardening. And these average between 700 and 900 per month if it's a good SHI. So here comes your average economic cost recovery rental. The total average monthly rental, approximately 2,760 to 2,960. And that's how it's made up. Now you've got to spread that because, you've got to spread it because the SHRA says that when you have a project, you cannot only go to the top end with your rentals. You have to make sure that you get a percentage of people in all those income bands. So what they call the primary income band, between 1,500 and 5,500, you must have 30% of the tenants must be in that income bracket when the project starts. Then you must have the other 70% in the secondary ones, but at the lower end of secondary, it's 20%, the middle, it's 20%, and the highest, it's 30%. Okay. So this spread is something that you have to achieve. So you can't just say, I'm going to take the money from government and I'm only going to rent out to 15 people, 15,000, or between 12 and 15,000, and I'm going to make a lot of money, because it doesn't work. The SHRA rate, that's why the SHRA actually is involved in actual regulations. There is the question, though. I've told you what your rentals are likely to be. So if you look at these, it gives a list of the maximum and the mean rentals. So 10% of your rentals are going to have to be around 620 Rand a month. 20% around about 1,395, 20% 2,112, going all up to 30%, which will sit in the area of about 4,866. Now, if you go and say, well, that's fine because it just stays like that, and that's very affordable to people. Well, obviously, it can't stay like that, because if you look at all your costs, what I call your input costs, every one of those is affected by inflation. So rates go up, we know that. The cost of doing maintenance increases on an annual basis. The cost of insurance increases, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're going to keep up a situation in which you've got an economic cost recovery rental, you're going to have to make annual increases in your rentals. And the SHRA at the moment sits and says that it should be at CPI. However, NASHO has developed a CPI basket for social housing, which shows that it should be sitting somewhere around CPI plus 2% on an annual basis. So that, I think, very much tells the story of how the finances work. And if anybody wants to have ask questions or seek clarity, that's absolutely right. But before I close off, I just want to talk about, a lot of people sitting here are saying, well, what does this mean to me? Does it mean that I can go and get social housing unit? Or does it mean this could provide an opportunity for me to be involved either as a social entrepreneur or even as an employee of one of these organizations? And I just want to stress that in our view, it's terribly important that we increase the number of young, particularly young Black professionals who are involved in the sector, because we believe that it's a sector which must be effective and efficient, and at the same time it must be transforming and transformative as well. So what are the spaces that young professional might be able to fit into? First of all, Patandwa's alluded to it. You could, if you were a social entrepreneur, be thinking about setting up an accredited non-profit social housing institution. It's not an easy thing to do because there's not a lot of money available for the setup costs, and it takes at least 3 to 4 years before you get your first project completed, and therefore before you get your first income stream. But it is possible, and NASHO at the moment is working with the SHRA in running an incubation program with these new social housing businesses to help them to get to the point where they have their first income streams. So there are ways, but you've got to be very, very committed, and it doesn't suddenly bring you loads of money either. You've got to accept that it's a slow build up to the point when you have a proper flow of income. The other thing is you could do it through the ODAs, the for-profit companies, but you then need to have already access to land opportunities. You've got to invest 20% equity in the project, so you've got to have your own equity. But the important thing to note is, in this situation, you're not allowed to take profit from the social housing project. So even if you are able to build up a reserve, the expectation is that that reserve gets reinvested in the social housing. And at the moment, although this is being worked on by the SHRA, the rules on how you withdraw your equity from the project are a little bit unclear. So what's the other opportunity? You could work in an SHI. So one of those, how many, 28 we talked about earlier. And there's a range of different skill sets that are needed. There's a lot of their client services when you're working mainly with the tenants and issues around the tenants. There's asset management, there's financial management, personal management, community development, and other support services. Or you could work as a service provider or a consultant as well. And there's a range of different ways in which that can be done also. So finally, before we stop for questions, I just want to say that we're very happy, first of all, to be been invited tonight, but also that we're working with YIPA to look at what are the other things that we could do together, because we see the potential for a real partnership. So far, it's starting. Where we are is that we're using this as a platform to increase awareness of social housing, to provide some information and advice on the social housing sector opportunities. Obviously, where we can, support for people who choose to set up non-profit SHIs. And we are having a discussion, although it's very early stages, with YIPA about how we could perhaps look at an internship program within the sector. So, questions, everybody. Thank you very much for the chance to talk.
Malcolm, thank you so much. Thank you, Bathandwa and Malcolm. Great presentation indeed. There are a number of questions. One beginning in terms of the availability of opportunities for young women in the industry.
So, Bathandwa, do you want to take it or do you want me to take this one?
Please, Malcolm. No, please go for it, Malcolm.
Yeah. Well, I must tell you that we did some analysis of who was employed in the SHIs among our members, and we showed that there was a much higher level of women middle senior managers and women sitting on the boards of the non-profit SHIs than in almost any other industry, comparable industry, and certainly much more than the private sector. So I think that the opportunities are there, and there is an emphasis with that most of our members in trying to increase the number of women who are involved. And I can't remember, but at the last count, I think about 7, 8 of our members, the CEO was a woman. I have to pull out the figures, but certainly much more woman representation and more senior positions in SHIs than in most other industries.
Oh, okay. Great to hear about that. Clearly transformation is taking place. Another question, Malcolm and Bathandwa, it's relating to the application process. This is a vast question because people are actually asking who qualifies. They want to know of the process. They want to know of the restrictions as well. So perhaps if you could just take us briefly through that.
Okay. So to apply, number one, to qualify for social housing, you have to be a South African citizen. You must be a South African citizen who has a consistent or a predictable income, because when you actually apply for social housing units, the SHI that you would apply to, they have to do their own due diligence in terms of checking if you as a potential tenant can actually afford to stay in the social housing, if you can be able to pay to stay in the social housing, and what type of disposable income do you have after your commitments or your monthly commitments. So you must be a South African citizen. Social housing targets people who are in households, so you must have dependents. It doesn't target people who live as singles, so you must have dependents. You're South African, you're a household, and you have a steady income. And then you make your application. Sometimes you can make your application to the municipality if the municipality has actually set up a social housing department and they are taking applications. But the municipality does not allocate to social housing. What they would do if they are accepting your applications, they would pass those onto social housing institutions which are operating in that space. And then finally, it's up to the social housing institution to determine whether you're a good tenant or not. So you must be South African household, have an ID, and provide three months bank statements and provide some proof of income. And you take that to the SHI, and then they will obviously do a credit check and all of that to see if you are able to pay to live in social housing.
Okay, Batandra, thank you very much for that, for the information. But I think in this context also, I'd like to ask in terms of someone who's pursuing a social housing project as a young entrepreneur, you know, I mean, one of the key things that are required is some 30% of equity of some sort. And I mean, that could be different in terms of the magnitude of the project itself. So how can young entrepreneurs, I mean, you've just started working, you don't have much equity perhaps to put down. How can young entrepreneurs actually go on about that?
So I think when Malcolm was presenting, he mentioned that you have to be not just any type of entrepreneur, you'd have to be a social entrepreneur who understands that they're not necessarily going to get a lot of profits out of being an SHI quite quickly. But if you are going to get to a point where you start making money, it's going to take you time. That's if you want to get into the space as a for-profit company. But it's much easier to get into the space as a social housing institution, where that's an NPO, where you would register yourselves as an NPO with the SHRA. And the SHRA has a specific criteria of various documentation that you need to set up an SHI. And then you take it from there. It's either you have your own land. If you don't have your own land, you might be operating in an area where the municipality is packaging sites and offering such sites to SHIs through a RFP, a call for proposals, and they'll obviously do an assessment of the proposal that you've submitted. And should your proposal be the one that wins, you will get a land availability agreement, which will then allow you to start packaging your project. And once you have an LAA, then you have access to other grants within the SHRA that you can use to actually package your projects and be able to do the things that you wouldn't be able to do because you wouldn't have the money. So there are subsidies available, but once you have a project or a land availability agreement, yeah, Malcolm, if I've left something out, please elaborate.
No, I think that covers it pretty well. I mean, if you're going to be an ODA, then you have to bring in your equity of 20%, yeah. and generally you have to have found a piece of land, because there are not many municipalities that are going to give you a piece of land as an ODA. SHI, you've got to go through an accreditation process with the SHRA. But then the major challenge, as Batandra says, once you've done that, is how do you get access to your first piece of land or your first building in order to be able to get your first development? Because until you've got your first development completed, you don't have any income stream, you don't have any money coming in to the organization. Yeah. So, I mean, certainly if people are serious and they're wanting to, are on the process or thinking about setting up such a non-profit company, then we would certainly be able to give you some practical advice. But yeah, but what you've got to understand is that it's not an instant path to loads of money is the way of describing it. And I think what you also got to understand is that where you do get land, that land is provided on condition that it remains social housing. So you can't scheme that you're going to get this piece of land and you're going to use it for social housing for 5 years, and then you're going to start renting out the properties on the open market, because you can't do that. You're tightly contained to continue using that land for social housing.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that, Malcolm and Patandwa. So I'm going to be closing off with one last question. And this is with regards to technology. I mean, we're all moving towards the fourth industrial revolution. So is there any technology you're involved in social housing in order to help the neighborhoods become self-sustaining?
To help the neighborhood.
Malcolm, I'll speak about Umadula Moho in providing Wi-Fi and internet access.
Yeah, no, sure.
And then there's the whole green code, housing code that you know more about. So if an SHI has developed a project, it's up to the SHI to think about what sort of tech or technology-based instruments they want to use to make their projects effective or efficient. Some SHIs, especially during the COVID period, were offering new Wi-Fi. So I saw in the question section that someone is asking, is Wi-Fi available? Yes, there are SHIs who are looking into providing Wi-Fi in their projects. Obviously, the owners, the SHI owners, are approaching the service providers and saying, what deals can you guys offer us, considering the type of markets that we are catering to be able to make Wi-Fi accessible to such tenants. So Wi-Fi is possible. It's up to the SHI. Malcolm?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. That is being provided. I mean, quite clearly also, every one of many of the bigger social housing institutions also run community development neighborhood programs, and a couple of them do that where they actually provide computer rooms and they do computer training for tenants and sometimes for other people in the local neighborhood because they want to develop that relationship. But I think also within the social housing institutions themselves, they obviously have to run good electronic communication systems. They also need to have the systems that are going to allow them to keep all their records around maintenance and the maintenance spend and placing of orders, et cetera. And there's also the other property management aspects, the storage of your tenancies and your tenancy details, et cetera, dealing with queries and how quickly. So all of those management information systems, I think increasingly they need to move towards a more sort of computerized basis to them. And I don't think we not yet very sophisticated in that field in South Africa at the present time. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Malcolm, there's also the tech around the design of social housing. I know that's happening in some spaces.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, first of all, there are norms and standards around the quality and type of accommodation, and obviously that must involve some level of greening as well. Very, very important. I mean, greening is a difficult one in social housing because often the capital costs of greening are higher than not greening.
Yeah.
The savings you make are terribly important in order to maintain affordability for your tenants. And so how do you pay for this? Because very often greening in many projects is paid for from the savings you actually get over the longer term, the capital costs of greening. Whereas in social housing, you want to pass on some of those savings, at least to your tenants, to make things more affordable. So that's a difficult balance, but work has been done on that, and there are initiatives that are dealing with that, yes. So.
Okay, thank you very much for that, gentlemen. And I must just compliment you, Malcolm and Patandwa. I believe you two just make such a great team. I believe you complement each other in your expertise. I mean, social housing has been identified as one of the tools that can be utilized in regenerating inner cities. And I believe that the combo and the expertise from Batando's side in terms of him being an urban planner, and Malcolm, your expertise in social housing, just are a beautiful combination. We are running out of time. I'm afraid I have to conclude. I would like to announce and let our guests know that if there are any further questions, they're more than welcome to actually engage us on webinar@yipa.co.za. And without any further...
Can I just also say that NASHO has a website, so we've got a lot of stuff on the website. It's, if you just Google NASHO, NASHO, South Africa, it'll come up. So if you want further information, certainly it's there. And as I say, we're open to be contacted around critical issues, whether it's through YIPA or directly, if there are issues you're wanting to follow up on.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. Yes, they are more than welcome to contact NASHO. They're more than welcome to contact YIPA. After all, we are fostering a partnership between the two.
Absolutely. I agree.
I would love to also encourage our guests to please follow us on Instagram and also to join YIPA in order for them to actually be exposed to more and to learn more, because we are actually for the youth. So we are all working together towards empowering the property practitioners. Without any further waste of time, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Good night.
And thanks a lot for inviting us.
Thank you, everyone.
Appreciate it. Take care.
All right, bye.
Bye.